For those who haven't seen Star Trek the original series and want something of an overview about what the series was about, here's a summary of the first season. This will give you a basic understanding of where each episode fits in the overall canon of Star Trek. Although I go into more detail about the episodes I find more interesting and less detail about the others. I also caution you that this summary will be filled with spoilers. Gene Roddenberry began work on Star Trek in 1964. David Gerrold, a writer for Star Trek, once said, "I have this hunch, which I will never be able to prove, that Gene Roddenberry was sitting and watching Forbidden Planet and he said, let's do this as a TV series." There are similarities between the story of The Cage, Star Trek's original pilot, and Forbidden Planet. In both, there is a woman left behind from a previous expedition, for example. Stephen J. Rubin says, "Forbidden Planet gives a kind of military hierarchy to the crew. There's a captain, there's a second in command, a medic, there are essentially the blaster men. The whole concept of a naval ship applied to outer space begins heavily with Forbidden Planet and to me is a direct influence on Star Trek. The first captain of the Enterprise in the original pilot was Christopher Pike. A couple of people being considered to play Captain Pike were Robert Loggia and Leslie Nielsen. Perhaps Leslie Nielsen would have made the influence of Forbidden Planet a bit too obvious, but Robert Loggia as captain of the Enterprise is a fascinating idea." As many folks know, Star Trek had two pilots. The first pilot was rejected and it was called The Cage. On the planet Talos, there is a species capable of creating illusions, and they use these illusions to try to trap Captain Pike. They can create any illusion that their captives want them to create. Pike eventually learns of the ruse, and the Talosians decide to let him go because they come to understand that humans get very violent when subjected to captivity. Oddly, this episode is superior than the second pilot in many ways. The sets look less goofy and better constructed. Number one, the original first officer is an awesome character, and it sucks she wasn't kept in the series. Test audiences apparently had trouble buying a woman being second in command. Roddenberry says, "The reason they turned it down was that it was too cerebral and there wasn't enough action and adventure. The Cage didn't end with a chase and a right cross to the jaw the way all manly films were supposed to end. There were no female leads then. Women in those days were just set dressing. So another thing they felt was wrong with our film was that we had Majel as a female second in command of the vessel."
They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They thought that I made it too complicated. They felt I had offered them a wagon train to the stars, which I had, because I wanted to sell it. And Westerns were very big at the time. And they felt that I'd double-crossed them. I'd written them this thing about where the mind went in certain ways, and they wanted someone with bare knuckles and a fist fight.
Roddenberry also added Uhura to the cast, partially to stick it to the folks who tried to tell him not to cast black characters.
I was pleased that in those days, when you couldn't get even blacks on television, that I not only had a black, but a black woman and a black officer. And that'll show them.
Among the differences between this pilot and later episodes are the fact that instead of warp drive, they have time warp. And when the warp drive fails, the Enterprise can switch to rockets instead of impulse engines. Spock is largely played the same, but smiles occasionally. Leonard Nimoy said that since Jeffrey Hunter, who played Captain Pike, was so subtle, it would have been hard to also play Spock as subtle. It would just be too boring. After Shatner was cast and he started doing his special brand of acting, shacting I call it, Nimoy was then able to be a lot more reserved. There's this thing that disguises itself as hot-looking ladies so it can suck all of the salt out of your body. This wasn't the first episode filmed with the new crew, but it was the first episode aired because the network thought a space monster would be a good way to hook people into the show. Charlie is this creepy kid who was raised on a planet where he was isolated from other people. He's socially awkward and very insecure, and when exposed to women for the first time, he makes creepy advances toward Yeoman Rand, and when scolded for it, he takes his frustration out on people with his telekinetic powers. I'm amazed that even in the 60s, folks didn't laugh at Yeoman Rand's goofy hat. I know it's supposed to be a wig, but it looks so little like real hair that it hardly counts as a wig. It's a hat. They eventually got rid of Yeoman Rand because they didn't want people to think that there was a thing between her and Kirk. If the audience thought the two were a couple, the producers thought that the audience would get upset when they saw Kirk fraternizing with all of those alien ladies. That's why after the first season, you didn't see her again until Star Trek the Motion Picture. This episode is probably most remembered for the scene in which Sulu is shirtless and fencing. The crew encounters a virus that makes everyone act as though they are drunk. This episode was effectively remade in the TNG episode The Naked Now. That's the one where Tasha Yar hooks up with Data. In this original series episode, Nurse Chapel tries to get more friendly with Spock. Her attraction to Spock is a running theme throughout the series. This was the first episode produced with the new crew, but the third to be aired. This one had a different cast from the other episodes in the series. Uhura's job was done by a dude, and the Doctor was Dr. Piper instead of Dr. McCoy. The premise was that a couple of crew members are given telekinetic abilities and go mad with power. They put contact lenses on the actors playing Gary Mitchell and Elizabeth Daner that were just tinfoil stuck in the middle of the lenses with only a pinhole for them to see through. Gary Lockwood, who played Gary Mitchell, had several problems with the tinfoil contact lenses, which is why he looks like he's looking in random directions a lot of the time. He said, "They didn't blind me for the first few days, but after the first few days, the eyes swelled up and got sore. Then to have them on for just 2 or 3 days was agonizing." Gary uses his telekinetic powers to create a tombstone with Kirk's name on it that says James R. Kirk. This was before they established that his middle initial was T 3 episodes later in the episode Mudd's Women. This episode was written by Richard Matheson, the author of the story I Am Legend. A transporter malfunction causes Kirk to be split into a friendly version and an evil version. It contains some pretty epic shacting. Also, there's lots of goofy lighting to make the evil Kirk look sinister. This was before the idea that the phasers could be set to stun. Instead, if you wanted to shoot somebody without killing them, you just set the phaser to setting 1. Harry Mudd is a con man traveling with 3 women he uses to manipulate and grift people. There are lots of close-ups of the ladies from Mudd's ship with this weird, soft focus. They used this fuzzy filter on the lens anytime they wanted you to know that a lady or an alien or something was supposed to be hot. Ostensibly, the attractiveness of these ladies is due to these pills that they take. Before dilithium crystals were introduced into canon, the warp drive required regular lithium crystals to function. They find a planet with lithium mines, and the miners offer to hand them over in exchange for the women. McCoy wonders if these ladies are really more attractive than other women, or if they just seem more attractive because they act that way. One of the ladies is given a fake hotness drug and begins to believe she is more attractive, which makes her act more confidently, and that confidence makes her just as attractive as the real drug did. I guess that's the moral of the story. This is the first episode in which guys in red shirts are sent down to a planet where they are promptly murdered. There's this planet with an android played by the guy who played Lurch on the Addams Family. The android was built by the extinct aliens that once lived on the planet called the Old Ones, which was an intentional reference to Lovecraft. Dr. Roger Corby, the only person living on the planet, creates an android duplicate of Kirk in an attempt to take over the ship. As Kirk's mind is being duplicated, he starts shouting racial slurs about Spock in order to trick the duplication machine into making the duplicate racist against Vulcans, so Spock will know that it isn't really Kirk. The crew finds a planet filled with kids who have to fend for themselves because all of the adults died of a plague. One of the kids is played by this guy who is clearly an adult cast as a kid because he has this weird, vaguely babyish face. Kirk gets put into a mind control device like in that South Park episode in which they go to the planetarium. The device is intended to be used to rehabilitate criminals, but instead is used to control their minds. This is that weird episode with Clint Howard. This alien threatens the Enterprise, and Kirk tells him that the ship contains corbamite, which is a substance that will destroy any vessel that attacks it. This is a lie, but the alien falls for it. They beam aboard the ship and discover that the alien is really Clint Howard. These episodes were an opportunity for Roddenberry to air the original Star Trek pilot with Captain Pike. Pike has been injured, so they figure they might as well drop him off on this planet that makes all the mind illusions so he can live under the illusion that he has no injuries. Kirk partly grew up on a Terran colony called Tarsus IV, which was run by a guy who turned genocidal. He was thought to be dead, but no body was found. When Kirk and another guy from that colony watched a Shakespearean play together, the other guy noticed that one of the actors bore a significant resemblance to Kodos, the genocidal ruler of Tarsus IV. Kodos killed people according to whether or not he saw them as eugenically fit. I suspect he was something of an early model for the character Khan. There's an interesting bit of canon in this episode that seems to have gone unelucidated. Dr. McCoy offers Spock a drink, and Spock says that his father's race was spared the dubious benefits of alcohol. McCoy's response is, "Now I know why they were conquered." Conquered by whom? Who conquered the Vulcans? This is the first episode to feature the Romulans. Romulans were intended to be modeled after ancient Romans. One of the Romulans in this episode even had a Latin-sounding name. The similarity between the Romulans and the Romans was downplayed in later episodes and The Next Generation. In TNG, they also put these stupid-looking ridges on the Romulans' heads to differentiate them from Vulcans. Although Earth fought a long war with the Romulans, no human had ever seen a Romulan, so nobody knew of their relationship with the Vulcans. No humans, anyway. The Enterprise encounters the Romulans when some outposts near the neutral neutral zone between Federation space and the Romulan Empire were attacked. Then there's this one guy who gets paranoid that there's a Romulan spy on the Enterprise, and when it's discovered that Romulans look exactly like Vulcans, he immediately becomes suspicious of Spock. The main Romulan was played by Mark Leonard, the guy who later played Spock's father, Sarek. Anyway, the Romulans attack on the Federation side of the neutral zone, and Kirk worries that they'll be back with more ships if they appear weak. So he tries to strike back at them before they cross back into the neutral zone. If the Enterprise crosses into the neutral zone, that would be taken as a provocation of war and be used by the Romulans as an excuse for retaliation. Because they have a cloaking device, the Enterprise can't catch them, so Kirk decides to follow them into the neutral zone despite the consequences. Eventually, Kirk tricks them into uncloaking, and they are able to disable the Romulan ship. This episode probably had the most outdoor scenes that were actually shot outdoors instead of on a stage with a bunch of styrofoam rocks. McCoy and Sulu beam down to this planet where McCoy sees a rabbit in a waistcoat followed by Alice from Alice in Wonderland and gets freaked out. He hails the Enterprise and is like, "I don't know if we should take our shore leave on this planet because ever since I got here I've been tripping balls." Kirk thinks that McCoy's just making shit up, so Kirk will go down to the planet to relax, which he doesn't want to do. Then Sulu finds this loaded gun lying around and starts shooting it. Apparently it didn't seem odd to him that there was a gun lying on the ground on an uninhabited planet that was apparently unknown to Starfleet. It turns out that the planet just takes whatever is in your mind and makes it real. Kirk realizes this when he starts seeing ex-girlfriends. McCoy and some lady he likes were apparently thinking of some jouster on a horse because one popped out of nowhere and starts stabbing him, ostensibly killing him. When they take the armor off, they find only a mannequin inside. Then Lieutenant Rodriguez gets strafed by a fighter plane and his girlfriend Angela gets shot. After Kirk thinks about his days at the Academy, he sees the Irish guy who used to bully him. He chases him through the Vasquez rocks that would be used again in the episode where Kirk fights the Gorn. Then the guy who runs the planet randomly shows up and explains the whole thing. McCoy also shows up again with two girls wearing fur bikinis. I suspect Michael Crichton ripped off this episode when he wrote Westworld and Sphere. They both contain ideas featured in this show. Several members of the crew get stranded on a dangerous planet and have to figure out how to get off of it. They not only have to figure out how escape is possible, but also what means of securing their survival is most moral and/or logical. This episode has some of the best arguments between Spock and McCoy. DeForest Kelley once said, "The Spock-McCoy situation is a thing that started with a very small moment. It was just a line that he threw at me, and I in turn threw the line back in a certain manner. Nobody thought much about it at the time, but when it hit the screen it created an uproar, so they started to build on it and put more of that in." I suspect he was referring to this episode. The crew ends up on a planet curated by Trelane, a guy who has been looking at Earth through a telescope and has recreated part of what he saw. Since the planet is several hundred light years from Earth, what he has seen is how Earth looked several centuries prior. The crew has to explain the ways in which humans of the present century have progressed. He assumes they are just as barbaric as they were back then. He's disappointed that humans aren't what he expected because he saw all the war and revolutions on Earth and thought this planet is awesome. Kirk had to tell him no, it wasn't awesome, it sucked, and you suck. This is the one with the Gorn. It had the most hilarious fight scene ever. Some aliens didn't like how the Enterprise and the Gorn ship were fighting, so they put Kirk and the Gorn captain on a nearby planet and told them to fight mano a mano. Kirk is repeatedly dismayed by his inability to kill this guy by hitting him with styrofoam rocks. The Enterprise is sent back in time to the 1960s by something Spock calls whiplash after being pulled toward a black star, whatever any of that means. This is the same phenomenon they were to use later in Star Trek IV to go back to the 80s and save the whales. The Enterprise gets chased by a fighter jet, so they beam the pilot on board. He expresses the same surprise that there are women on the ship that Trelane, the guy who loved the 19th century, did. Kirk also explains that the authority that oversees the Enterprise's mission is the United Earth Space Probe Agency, mentioned previously in Charlie X, but not mentioned or alluded to again until the Voyager episode Friendship 1. The Enterprise encounters an ion storm requiring Kirk to eject the ship's ion pod. The pod was manned at the time, resulting in the death of an officer. Kirk says that ejecting the pod was necessary, but the computer logs conflict with when Kirk says that the ejection actually occurred, so Commodore Stone orders a court-martial. Apparently Kirk and the guy he killed didn't get along, so Kirk was suspected of murder. Initially, Stone didn't want to issue the court-martial because no captain had ever been court-martialed before, and he didn't want what he believed Kirk did to tarnish the image of Starfleet. He offers Kirk a demotion instead, but Kirk refuses and insists upon the court-martial. During Kirk's trial, a computer mentions the Axanar peace mission later elaborated on in the episode Whom Gods Destroy and the fan-made movie Prelude to Axanar. Turns out the guy was alive the whole time and attempted to frame Kirk for his murder. This is the first episode to mention the Prime Directive. The crew goes to a planet where a ship had disappeared 100 years prior, and the society of the inhabitants looks exactly like Earth in the 19th century. But they are all part of this weird cult who obey this guy named Landrew. They discover that Landrew is a computer, so they destroy it with their phasers. This is easily the best episode of the first season and one of the best episodes of the series. The Enterprise finds a ship called the SS Botany Bay, full of people in suspended animation. They have been floating in space since the 1990s. They wake up their leader, Khan, and bring him aboard the ship where the ship's historian, Marla MacGyvers, gets a crush on him. Khan is revealed to be a product of selective breeding, although in later incarnations this was changed to genetic engineering. He and his genetically altered friends fled Earth because they tried to take it over during the Eugenics Wars. It's mentioned that the Eugenics Wars was another name for World War III, although World War III seems to be described as a separate conflict in other episodes. After they try to take over the ship, Kirk dumps Khan, MacGyvers, and Khan's crew on the planet Ceti Alpha 5. There's this planet populated by people who frequently go to war with the people on a neighboring planet, but instead of bombing and shooting each other, they run a computer simulation of the war, which gives them a list of people who would have died had the war really been fought, and those people have to be vaporized. They all agree to do this to avoid the infrastructure damage that actually fighting a war would cause. Things get dicey when the computer says that members of the Enterprise crew are on the kill list. There's a planet with flowers that shoot you with spores that make you apathetic and lazy. Spock gets hit by them and ends up falling in love with one of the inhabitants, so Kirk threatens to beat him over the head with a metal pipe. McCoy, because he's from the South, decides to go and find some ingredients to make a mint julep. There's a planet with a mine inhabited by rock monsters that kill miners for destroying its eggs. One of the rock monsters is injured, so McCoy has to patch it up with cement, despite the fact that he's a doctor, not a bricklayer. War is about to break out between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, and the planet Organia is caught in the middle of it. The Klingons try to take over the planet, and Kirk tries to convince the Organians to resist, but they have no interest in doing so, which annoys the hell out of him. It turns out that the reason that they don't resist is because they are able to make weapons ineffective with their minds. They prevent the Klingons and the Enterprise from fighting with one another, and this results in the Organian peace treaty. This was the most boringest episode of the first season. Kirk has to fight a guy from another universe who is made out of antimatter, which doesn't really make sense, but whatever. McCoy accidentally injects himself with cordrazine and starts tripping balls. He goes down to this planet with a time portal and jumps through it, ending up on Earth in the 1930s. The crew beam down after him, but they discover that he's messed up the timeline, so the Enterprise disappears and they end up stranded on the planet. Kirk and Spock have to follow McCoy back in time, and they find out that the timeline got all messed up because McCoy prevented the death of a woman who delayed America's involvement in World War II, which results in the Nazis winning. The crew beams down to this planet that's been decimated by giant fried eggs. This episode was the only one to feature Kirk's brother, Sam Kirk, played by Shatner with a fake mustache. So that's the first season of Star Trek the Original Series in a nutshell. I'm already working on a video for the second season, so expect that relatively soon. Also, let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see or like me to cover as I do these summaries.